By the end of the 12th century, annihilation had visited Avarignia. The largest empire in the world, that of the ancient and venerable Romans, beneath the austere and tactical emperor Fabianus III, launched an invasion of Avarignia. Panic set in across the Republic as men at the frontiers trembled with horrible trepidation. Archon Orgetorix shut himself in his chambers as the legions lined up behind the Pyrenees, ready to wash over them like a wave of rage and steel. He emerged 3 days later as he received news of Roman ships blockading Gibraltar. He stood before the Ephraim and gave a speech, which is not recorded in this chronicle, as before he was finished, the senators of the Ephraim beat the dwarf to death with canes and walking sticks. As such, an election was held and Archon Caecilius Caridas was chosen to lead the 250th Senate of the Ephraim in its rule of Avarignia. He was a smart, collected, reserved man who spoke in only the briefest, most necessary terms, and he would be the mind behind the coordinated effort against the Roman advance. First, the Roman advance was split into two theaters, the Pyrenees Front and the Hercules Front. The Pyrenees Front was headed up by General Gaius Sextus, and the Hercules Front by General Galba Septimus. Meanwhile, the Avarignian defense was much less centralized, with smaller, more mobile divisions commanded by personal commanders, the foremost of which were General Ondabeles Caridas, General Axon de Pravia, and General Maurius Gregorice. It began at the Battle of Melilla in July of 1196, where General Ondabeles Caridas assaulted an advancing Roman army under General Galba Septimus in the hopes of halting their advance and preventing them from making landfall on the Iberian Peninsula. Ondabeles and his 7,000 men decided to employ a feigned retreat, sallying forth only a few thousand to fight the 10,000 Romans, only to pull back and flank them with the rest of their army once they gave chase. And this indeed worked. The Romans gave chase, and the flanking army engaged, but just as the battle seemed as though it was about to be won, 18,000 more men came cresting over the hill. This horrifying sight caused Ondabeles and his men to flee, only to be ran down by light cavalry, resulting in the death of Ondabeles and all but 20 of his men, making the Battle of Melilla perhaps the most devastating defeat in all of Avarignian history. A separate legionary force of 16,000 men would go on to occupy Cadiz, followed by another 7,000 at Algeciras. Another defeat would be suffered in the north at Carcassonne, but on a much smaller scale. It was clear the Romans had chosen the south, and so resources were diverted there as such. What was wholly unexpected was that, in 1197, Roman ships would sail up the western coast and land in the west and north as well. This was beyond the strategic capabilities of the Republic, and command was relegated to even smaller units of soldiers. The general in control of the Roman northwestern advance was a particular man by the name of Severian Indicitus, the splinter house of the Indicidi family, which once ruled over Sardinia as sovereigns, had since become governors of the province, and now one of their honored sons had come to exact revenge upon the Republic, that target of their ancient ire. General Severian's sack of Caelum, which occurred over the course of 2 weeks in 1198, was savage in the extreme, and the original building of the Ephraim was burned to ashes, the only building left standing being the temple to Similci, where he offered the sacrifice of 100 bulls and burnt their flesh. The capital of the Republic was moved to Segovia, nestled in the mountains of the central chain. This is also where the armies of the Republic as a whole would regroup. Indeed, the Republic was in shambles, its cities in flames, and its armies in near total disarray as over 50,000 Roman legionaries picked the peninsula clean like a swarm of locusts. Archon Caecilius knew he needed a significant victory to keep the Republic alive, and fast. And so he sent small scouting parties to repeatedly harass the armies of General Severian, hoping to draw him close. Indeed, Severian knew what was happening, and allowed the Republic to become tired and moth-eaten before he engaged. Over the next 2 years, Segovia would be turned into an impregnable fortress, with the mountains to its back, funded by a great many successful raiding parties, which demoralized swaths of hungry Romans in a land they viewed as foreign and savage. But now the waiting had ended, and Severian approached. On the 12th of February 1200, Severian began the Battle of Segovia by commanding the archers among his 15,000 men rain death upon them. The men inside amounted to 9,000, but given they had the mountains to their back, they were secure in their defense, hoping to wear down the Roman army by way of attrition. This would drag on for months, Severian indeed losing men to starvation, while the men within the walls fell victim to disease. Severian grew impatient, and in 1201 launched an assault in Segovia with his 10,000 men. The clatter of their tall ladders echoed against the mountain face as the forces of the Republic poured boiling tar over the walls, scorching the Romans and killing hundreds of them in an instant. Others hefted boulders over the walls, which cracked the tall ladders and rolled down into the field below. These techniques were revolutionary at the time, despite their simplicity, while the Romans viewed them as duplicitous and dishonorable. Severian responded to this in a variety of unique ways, by sending men to tunnel under the walls, while others were tasked with piling earth up against the walls to make for a more secure grounding for ladders and to reduce the distance to the top. So this went on for some while, offensives and counter-offensives and defensives carried out by both sides. This was until 1203. Archon Caecilius was forced to settle a decision on who would be afforded larger rations, and he decided members of the Athraeum would have no set limit, while everyone else would have to make do with the limits imposed. This resulted in about a quarter of the servants and soldiers within the walls rising up in rebellion. Not enough to unseat the Archon, but more than enough to leave the walls unguarded for Severian's next attack. And so, on the 4th of December 1203, Segovia was overcome, and with it, Avarignia. Archon Caecilius was thrown from the highest peak of the walls, and the moment his body splashed into the muddy gore below, Rex Severian Indicitus chose himself as the leader of Avarignia. No election, no Athraeum, simply a king and his throne. Thus began the era of Roman rule over Avarignia, with Severian Indicitus beginning his own client house, separate from those who ruled Sardinia. Thus, it became necessary to distinguish them. The Indiciti who never left Avarignia would be known as Indiciti de Ostum. The Indiciti who conquered Sardinia would be known as Indiciti de Celia, and the Indiciti who returned to conquer Avarignia would be known as Indiciti de Roma, making the leader of Avarignia Rex Severian Indiciti de Roma. He issued a series of edicts as Roman taxes began to revive the war-torn peninsula, legalizing worship of the Celiatus Simulci, hunting down and killing every known member of the Caridosor, deporting families of significant Punic ancestry to other Roman provinces in need of workers, and embarking on a widespread campaign of urban revival and development. During his reign, Avarignia had its first exposure to things like running water, sewage systems, and access to the continental trade network, which linked all of Rome together. Avarignian cuisine developed by leaps and bounds during this period, access to a wider variety of higher quality ingredients resulting in things such as hathfase, honorable bread. Hathfase are made by combining a measure of rice and groats and boiling them together in the same pot, then frying them with onions and cheese to make small, crispy patties with a soft, savory interior. The wealthy would add salt, and even made a dessert version where the cheese was replaced with honey. Sometimes, as was fashion out in the country, an egg was added to the top of it. Hathfase and its various creative derivatives thus became the hallmark food of Avarignia. And so, things continued like this, Avarignian culture evolving into various new forms as cities were rebuilt and even expanded, and the various branches of the Indiciti family working together to ensure their rivals in the now crippled Caridi cohort would never be able to bring shame to Avarignia again. A look inside Roman administration revealed a huge variety of titles, duchies, and kingdoms, arranged and distributed in an almost impossibly complicated mess which spanned the entire continent. It was this complexity which partially helped the Andenid dynasty maintain control of such a vast and imposing empire. If nobody really knew how the system worked, then it would be that much harder to subvert it. So, most of the nobility decided to play the game which made sense, that being the game of imperial favoritism. Through a vast network of favors and supplications, plots and profits, schemes and exhortations, it all worked together for the good of Rome. On that topic, the 13th century proved fruitful for the great empires of the world, namely Rome, Phrygia, and Rajasthan, which would come to be known colloquially as the Three Sisters. In June of 1204, Imperator Fabianus IV rewarded Rex Severian for his exemplary service to Rome by giving him a seat on the imperial council, becoming the imperial legate of Rome, overseeing the legions of the empire. Meanwhile, rumors began to reach the west of a great and terrible conqueror at the helm of countless horsemen, whose steeds shook the earth at the edge of the world. His name was Temujin, and he brought with him another faith of those who venerated Yeshua. It maintained that certain clerics ordained in an unbroken chain from the first of Yeshua's followers were the true successors of the Church of Yeshua, and that they rejected a more centralized, overbearing version of the Church, an unnamed institution in the East. These Mongols called their faith Zovsanal, translating as right opinion or orthodox. Many did not take note of the Mongols' arrival to the world stage, especially not the Avarignian on the other side of the world. To most, they were simply yet another bizarre Eastern cult. As such, quietly, he overcame the Gugchuds of the far northeast, claiming them for the Zofsanal Church. Meanwhile, Rex Severian was settling into his position as king of Avarignia under the Roman Empire quite nicely. He was given a fair amount of autonomy, but also fed into the imperial economy, turning Avarignia into a central hub for slaves headed north and settlers headed south. This pressure caused many sub-Saharan Africans to migrate south, as more Greeks and Romans moved into their lands, often by force, facilitated by the expansionary jumping-off point that was Avarignia. Still, these settlers died in droves as malaria and other diseases made corpses of them. By 1211, the Mongols had cut clear across the northern edge of the world, coming into contact with Phrygia and the Caspian steppe. Needless to say, this caused many to view them, perhaps, as a more serious threat than was thought, but regardless, no one seriously believed some Central Asian cultists could hold their own against one of the Three Sisters. In July of 1222, the Mongol Khanate conquered the kingdom of the Caspian steppe, and now shared a border with Rome. Though this seems to be where the Khan stopped, and rested upon his achievements, cementing the reality of a fundamentally Christian East. For a long while thereafter, things were peaceful. Avarignia grew upwards instead of outwards, and flourished in the life which imperial authority granted them. So, satisfied with his work, Rex Severian Indichitus de Roma died in 1246 at the astounding age of 84, and his son, Rex Severian II Indichitus de Roma, ascended to the throne. Even while many called him Severian, the dog of Rome, many still called that conquering Roman general Savior of the Avarigines.